A Cotswold farmer, 70 years in the trade, hands like tree bark, was once asked what he made of Jeremy Clarkson. He said, "I've yet to meet a farmer who doesn't like this programme. 20 years making enemies, dreaded by politicians, sacked from one of the biggest jobs in British television. Farmers should have loathed him too. Instead, they made him one of their own. 15 reasons why." Coming right up. He showed the arithmetic nobody else would show. 1,000 acres. A full year of graft, mud, diesel, and worry. Up before dawn, home after dark. Every single decision a gamble against weather nobody controls and markets nobody can predict. And at the end of it all, £144 of profit. Not a scriptwriter's joke, dreamed up for comic effect. Not a number softened or rounded for television. The genuine, audited, entirely unglamorous result of farming 1,000 acres of England for 12 straight months. Farmers had known a version of that figure their entire working lives. They'd lived it, quietly, at kitchen tables long after the children were in bed, going through the books by lamplight, working out which bill could wait another month and which supplier would need placating with a phone call rather than a payment. They had simply never had a way of proving it to anyone outside the trade. Every well-meaning dinner party conversation about just growing some wheat, how hard can it be really, collapsed the moment that number appeared on screen, in Clarkson's own handwriting, at his own kitchen table, with his own visible disbelief written across his face. It wasn't a performance, you could see it. The number surprised even him, and that honest surprise did more for public understanding of farm economics than any government leaflet ever printed. And crucially, he didn't do it once and move on. He did it every single year, letting the figure change, letting viewers watch the business genuinely rise and fall with the seasons, refusing to let one dramatic number become a gimmick rather than an ongoing, honest ledger. He didn't hide the failures, he built the entire show around them. Crops that refused to come up, weeks of careful preparation, undone by a single cold snap. Machinery that failed at precisely the wrong moment, in the middle of a field, in the rain, with no signal to call for help, and no dealership open until Monday. A harvest ruined by 3 days of weather that arrived exactly when it shouldn't have, turning a season of careful planning and back-breaking labour into a season's loss overnight. Most people, filming their own business for a global audience of millions, would have quietly cut that footage in the edit suite and kept the highlights real. The sunshine, the golden fields, the triumphant harvest montage. Clarkson leaned into it every single time because he grasped something the wider culture had somehow forgotten in decades of glossy countryside programming. The disasters are the job. Farming isn't the part that goes to plan. It is the endless, unglamorous, unpaid management of the part that doesn't, and the willingness to get up the next morning in the same mud and do it again regardless of how the previous day ended. He even let the cameras catch him losing his temper over it, swearing at machinery, sitting in silence in a ruined field, which is precisely the moment most television personalities would have called cut. He put the cost of Brexit into plain English on primetime television without flinching once. The disappearance of EU subsidies that farmers had planned entire businesses around for a generation. The vague replacement schemes that promised transformation in a press release and delivered in practice mostly paperwork and uncertainty. A local pig farmer near Diddley Squat, on the brink of losing an entire operation overnight, taking no wage himself, simply to keep the animals fed through a crisis nobody had voted for by name. Clarkson didn't dress any of it up as politics, didn't reach for a slogan or a side. He simply filmed it, honestly, in the voice of a man genuinely alarmed by what he was witnessing on his own doorstep, and let millions of viewers who had never once thought about a subsidy in their life watch, in real time, exactly what its sudden absence does to a working farm and the families who depend on it. He asked the questions a farmer would ask, not the questions a politician would want asked, and that distinction, small as it sounds, is precisely why farmers trusted the segment when they trust almost nothing else that comes out of a television studio on the subject of agricultural policy. He showed the weather as the real villain of British farming, because it is, not a council, not a supermarket buyer squeezing margins to nothing, not a government minister making decisions in a warm office 300 miles away, rain that simply wouldn't stop when the crop needed dry ground, then drought that wouldn't break when it needed rain. A crop lost not through any error of judgment or lack of effort, but through pure meteorological bad luck of the kind that no amount of skill, capital, or hard work can insure against. City audiences who'd spent their whole lives simply assuming food arrives watched a millionaire television presenter stand in a ruined field looking genuinely, helplessly defeated by the sky above him, and understood perhaps properly for the first time in their lives that this is the actual, daily, uninsurable gamble every British farmer accepts, year after year, without complaint, without a union to bargain on their behalf, and largely without anyone watching. He didn't dramatise it with sweeping music and slow motion. He simply stood there, soaked through, and let the silence do the work, which is exactly how farmers themselves tend to experience it. He took on the planning system, and farmers had been fighting that exact, exhausting battle quietly for years, usually alone and usually losing. Every sensible application refused, every reasonable request for a car park or a modest farm shop treated as though he'd proposed flattening a cathedral to build a motorway service station. Local farmers watched this unfold on their televisions and thought, at long last, someone is filming it, because that particular fight against a planning department that seems to regard any working farm trying to diversify simply to survive as an act of vandalism against a landscape it has never had to earn a living from, is one that nearly every farming family in Britain has fought at some point, usually alone, usually unheard, usually at their own considerable and entirely unrecoverable expense. What made it resonate wasn't the eventual outcome, win or lose. It was the sheer grinding tedium of it, faithfully reproduced on screen. The letters, the delays, the site visits, the committee meetings that decided years of a family's livelihood in an afternoon. Farmers recognised every beat of it because most of them had lived through their own quieter, less televised version. If you've made it this far, you clearly appreciate a proper story about British life. And that's precisely what this channel exists for. So to hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment below. We read every single one, and we'd genuinely love to know which of these 15 reasons speaks to you most. He never once gave up, even when the council won. The restaurant, built inside 48 hours specifically to slip past a formal objection before it could be lodged. An act of pure, stubborn ingenuity that any farmer who has ever fought a planning department will recognise immediately, forced to close months later regardless. After all that effort and expense, he didn't walk away from the land in disgust, didn't quietly sell up and retreat to somewhere less contentious and considerably less muddy. He simply found the next route through, because that stubbornness, that refusal to be the man who gives up the moment Whitehall or the local authority makes life genuinely impossible, is precisely the quality that has kept most British farms in family hands across 4, 5, 6 generations, through wars, recessions, and bureaucrats of every stripe. That refusal to quit is, quietly, the single trait every farming family recognises in itself, whether or not they'd ever put it into words over Sunday lunch. His brewery buys British barley at prices farmers can actually plan a year around, rather than gamble on. Hawkstone didn't simply stamp a Cotswold name on a bottle and hope nostalgia would do the rest of the work. It created a guaranteed buyer for local grain, a market that doesn't rise and fall on the whims of international commodity trading, where an entire year's income can hinge on a decision made in a boardroom on another continent by people who have never set foot on a British farm. For barley growers who had spent years accepting whatever price the market decreed and being grateful for it, that kind of stability is worth considerably more than any amount of television exposure or celebrity endorsement. It meant a farmer could sit down in January and actually plan the year ahead, rather than simply hope, which is a luxury the arable trade has rarely been offered by anyone, celebrity or otherwise. The farm shop became a shop window for farms that had never had one of their own. Produce from surrounding farms, sold to visitors who had driven hours specifically for the privilege and would otherwise never have set foot near a working farm gate in their entire lives. Smaller producers with no marketing budget, no camera crew, and no famous name to trade on suddenly had an outlet they could never have built alone, no matter how good their cheese, or their honey, or their sausages actually were. Clarkson's 3-mile queue of cars, the one that infuriated the neighbours so thoroughly, became, almost by accident, their customer base too. Neighbouring farms that had struggled for years to sell direct, without a website or a following, found themselves with a shelf, a label, and an actual queue of paying customers, virtually overnight. He created jobs in a corner of the country that had been quietly losing them for decades, one shop closure and one empty farmhouse at a time. The pub alone employs well over 100 people, where rural employment has never come easily, and where the young have long been told, gently but firmly, that their future lies somewhere else entirely. A city, a call centre, a life that doesn't involve mud on their boots. Farming families know exactly how rare this is. A working farm that grows local jobs rather than shedding them, that gives young people in the area a reason to stay rather than a reason to leave, and a reason to stay working the land rather than abandoning it for something safer. He proved, more persuasively than any government strategy paper ever managed to, that people will still travel for honest food, given half a reason to believe in it. 3-mile traffic queues down country lanes that hadn't seen that kind of disruption since the war, all for a jar of honey. Every rural policy document produced in Whitehall over the last 20 years had confidently argued that consumers wanted convenience above all else, cheap and fast, and entirely forgettable, sold in identical packaging in identical supermarkets nationwide. Clarkson's car park disagreed rather emphatically, several thousand cars at a time, week after week, month after month, regardless of what the policy papers predicted. It was proof, delivered in traffic jams rather than statistics, that the appetite for genuine provenance was never dead. It had simply never been given anywhere proper to go. He gave Caleb Cooper the platform and never once tried to dim it to protect his own dignity or his own reputation as the expert in the room. Correcting a wealthy, famous television presenter on camera week after week, with the barely concealed exasperation of a man explaining something obvious, and not entirely certain it's sinking in this time either. Clarkson didn't edit that out. He let it run, gladly, repeatedly, at his own considerable expense, and to his own considerable comic detriment. And in doing so, he handed a genuine working farmer, not an actor, not a presenter, a real farmer with real expertise, built over a real working lifetime on that exact land, a national stage that no government campaign, no agricultural trade body, no televised countryside documentary had ever managed to build for anyone in his position, at any point in living memory. It would have been easy and commercially tempting to make Caleb the sidekick. Clarkson never did. He made him, quite deliberately, the one person on the farm who was actually right. He showed in exhausting and entirely unglamorous detail exactly how much genuine skill the job requires, day in and day out. Crop rotation, planned years in advance and adjusted constantly. Livestock welfare, requiring attention every single day of the year, including Christmas morning. The maintenance of machinery that costs more than most houses, and breaks down regardless of how carefully it's serviced. The precise, hard-won knowledge that takes an entire working life to properly absorb, and that Clarkson quite visibly, and quite often, did not possess, no matter how much he clearly wanted to. Every mistake he made on camera became, by pure accident, the clearest advertisement British farming has ever produced for how genuinely difficult the trade is, and how little credit it usually receives from a country that eats 3 times a day without a second thought about where any of it came from. It is in effect a masterclass filmed by the least qualified person in the room, and that is exactly why it worked as well as it did. He never once played the expert, and farmers noticed immediately, because farmers always notice. He didn't arrive with the breezy confidence of a man who'd read a few articles on a flight and now understood the countryside better than the people who'd worked it for generations before him. He arrived quite openly, knowing almost nothing, and let farmers watching at home enjoy every single moment of him, discovering that, in real time, on national television, with no editing to soften the embarrassment. There is a particular, quiet satisfaction in watching someone learn, publicly and repeatedly, exactly what you yourself have always known and have rarely been thanked for knowing. Clarkson gave farmers that pleasure, week after week, without ever once resenting them for laughing at him, and often laughing along with them at his own expense. That humility, entirely uncharacteristic for the man who'd spent decades never once admitting fault on camera, is arguably the single biggest surprise of the entire series. He achieved more for public awareness of British farming in 2 seasons than decades of official campaigns had managed between them. Combined, one working farmer put it plainly and rather generously given his profession's usual scepticism of celebrities, saying that whether Clarkson had meant to or not, he'd done more for the industry with 2 seasons of television than any farming organisation had achieved in years of dedicated trying. The British Farming Awards evidently agreed with him. They gave Clarkson an accolade for flying the flag for British agriculture, an honour handed out by people with every professional reason to be sceptical of a celebrity playing at their trade for the cameras, and who gave it to him regardless, because they recognised, plainly and without reservation, what he'd actually achieved for people they'd spent careers trying to help. Farming bodies had spent decades commissioning reports nobody read. Clarkson had, almost by accident, produced something the entire country actually watched. He carried farmers' grievances all the way to Westminster and made an entire nation think properly, perhaps for the very first time, about where its food actually comes from. The young farm manager, who began this whole story simply working the land for modest wages, ended up speaking directly with the Prime Minister about the issues facing young farmers across the country, a conversation British agriculture had rarely, if ever, had this kind of direct access to in living memory, and millions of ordinary viewers who had never once considered the risk, the weather, the subsidy paperwork, or the relentless, uninsurable uncertainty behind a loaf of bread or a bag of potatoes, sat down expecting nothing more than a comedy about a chaotic celebrity farm, and came away thinking seriously, some of them for the very first time in their entire lives, about British agriculture and the people who quietly, thanklessly, keep this country fed, storm after storm, season after season. That, in the end, is the achievement farming bodies will still be trying to properly measure for years to come. A nation that stopped, briefly, mid-scroll, and actually thought about its own dinner. So let's return to that Cotswold farmer. Hands like tree bark, leaning on his gate and his verdict on the whole affair. I've yet to meet a farmer who doesn't like this programme. It wasn't the tractors, it wasn't the jokes about Caleb's height, or the running argument with the council, or the theatrical exasperation that made for such compelling television. It was that, for the first time in most working farmers' lives, someone with a camera crew and a genuinely national audience told the truth about the job. The losses, the weather, the bureaucracy, the subsidies that vanished overnight, the arithmetic that never quite adds up in the farmer's favour, no matter how hard you work or how early you rise, and did not flinch from a single uncomfortable detail of it, not once, across every episode. He didn't romanticise farming into gentle countryside escapism for people who'd never once smelled a silage clamp or lost a night's sleep over a sick animal. He showed it precisely as it is, brutal, uncertain, occasionally very funny, and almost always underpaid. And he did it with a level of honesty that 30 years of conventional rural broadcasting, with all its gentle voiceovers and rolling hills, had somehow never quite managed to deliver. That is why every farmer in Britain, whether they'd say it out loud in the pub or only admit it quietly to themselves, carries a quiet debt to Jeremy Clarkson. He was sacked from one of the biggest jobs in British television over an incident involving a cold steak and an aggrieved producer, an act of professional self-destruction by any reasonable measure. And out of the wreckage of that entirely self-inflicted disaster, he built something that did more for the reputation, the finances, and the public standing of British agriculture than most of the industry had managed across the previous 3 decades combined, without ever setting out to do so. He didn't set out to save farming. He simply refused, at every single opportunity, to look away from it, even when looking away would have been easier, cheaper, and considerably less muddy. And in a trade that has spent generations feeling unseen, unheard, and quietly taken for granted by a country that eats without asking questions, that turned out to be exactly what was needed. There's a version of this story where Jeremy Clarkson buys 1,000 acres, loses money in year 1, and quietly sells up within 18 months, chalking the whole thing up to an expensive lesson learned. Nobody would have blamed him for it in the slightest. Most people in his position, with his money and his options, would have done exactly that. He didn't. He stayed. He filmed the mess, the losses, and the endless, wearying arguments with the council, and somewhere along the way, almost without meaning to and certainly without planning it. He became one of the most unlikely and most genuine allies British farming has ever had. If you've enjoyed today's story, do subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss the next one. There's plenty more like it on the way, and we'd hate for you to miss it. Drop us a comment below and let us know which of these 15 reasons rings truest to you. And if you're a farmer yourself, we'd genuinely, sincerely love to hear your own reasons too. Thank you, as always, for watching.